Martin Stein lived a double life, an accountant by day, a courier for a crime boss by night. When his wife's betrayal and police pressure intertwined in his fate, he found himself on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Martin Stein sat in his car, impatiently waiting for any sign of movement. Finally, he heard the metallic clank that signaled the release of the hydraulic rams holding the ferry doors closed. Accompanied by creaks and groans, he saw a gap appear in the bow bulkhead ahead of him. He watched as the bow opened and the ramp lowered and extended into place. Then he had to wait his turn to drive onto solid ground, followed by the long trek through customs before he could truly say he was back in England. He pulled into the customs area and rolled down his window, the cold night air striking his face. "Anything to declare?" asked the uniformed man as he took Martin's passport. "I've got some cigarettes and alcohol," Martin replied, "but I've only been to Holland, bought them there." "Could you pull over to that spot there, Mr. Stein? We would like to examine your vehicle," the customs officer said, pointing to an empty bay. Martin couldn't believe it. He had made this trip many times and had never been stopped before. Annoyed by the inconvenience, he grumbled to himself as he pulled over to the designated spot, closed his window, and waited. Almost 15 minutes passed as Martin questioned his decision to use the ferry and road system instead of the much quicker and easier option of flying. Cigarettes and alcohol, that was all. He could make money from them, but if customs seized this load, it would wipe out his profits for the last 3 months. "Darn," he muttered to himself. "Darn, darn, darn." His self-reproach was interrupted by a tap on his window. "Mr. Stein, would you follow me?" said a tall man in a slightly wrinkled brown suit. Martin knew it wasn't a request. He got out of his car, locked it, and turned to follow the man. He was led inside a large building, through some corridors, and up 2 flights of stairs before he was finally shown into a room. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment, sir?" Again, not really a question. Martin entered the room. It was furnished with a metal-framed table, its formica-covered top showing scars from years of wear. 2 matching chairs stood on either side. Martin sat in the one farthest from and facing the door. Eventually the door opened, and the man who had led him there returned, carrying a large file and a laptop case. "Mr. Stein, may I call you Martin?" Before Martin could answer, he continued, "Good. You have just returned from Holland, haven't you?" Again, not waiting for an answer, he went on. "There you traveled to Amsterdam, where you met with Mr. Eric van der Zwart, to whom you delivered £2 million worth of conflict diamonds." He watched Martin intently as he spoke. The color began to drain from Martin's face at the mention of Amsterdam. He was completely pale at the precise mention of the diamonds. Martin remained silent, trying to figure out what was happening. He knew he'd been involved in something shady and had always assumed he could claim ignorance about being a courier for illegal diamonds. Now that it was spelled out for him, it couldn't have been anything else. He would have to be naive not to know what he was carrying. He'd had his suspicions from the first time, but it was on the second trip that he cracked the combination lock on the case he was transporting. He did it every time after that, mostly to keep himself occupied during the long ferry rides, dreaming of the day he'd have the courage to cut ties and escape. He pushed those thoughts aside and assessed his current situation. He hadn't been arrested or cautioned, and the man in the suit hadn't given his name. Martin was savvy enough to know something was off about this, so he simply sat and waited for the other man to speak again. As color returned to Martin Stein's face, Inspector Gray watched him closely. "Now, Mr. Stein, Martin, I believe we can help each other," he said, staring at Martin and gauging the bewilderment on his face. "As you've probably guessed by now, I'm investigating your employer. And no, before you make a fool of yourself, I don't mean Charles and Curtis Chiswick, for whom you work as an accountant. I'm referring to Mr. Francois Grimard, good old Mr. Grimm himself, The one you run errands for, the one your employers loan you out to. Martin's complexion paled again, and his head drooped in defeat. If you're willing, as I expect, to enlighten me and assist with my inquiries, I've been authorized to offer you a way out. Martin raised his head and looked at the inspector, surprised to see concern on his face. I'm offering you witness protection if you turn Queen's evidence. Yeah, like you did for Derek Bennett. That did him a lot of good, didn't it? Martin snapped, speaking for the first time since entering the building. Why don't you just beat me senseless and feed me to the pigs yourself? Actually, we were considering blowing you up, the policeman replied. If Martin had looked bewildered before, now his expression was utterly dumbfounded. Of course, if you refuse, we'll arrest you on your next trip. To Amsterdam, naturally. Or even worse for you, perhaps your replacement. Martin shuddered at the thought. He knew he was in serious trouble. If he said nothing, the best he could hope for was getting caught for smuggling, and then when the next shipment was intercepted, word would spread that he was a snitch. If he went to Grimm, he'd probably just be silenced. And again, when the next guy was caught, who would blame Grimm for eliminating him? That left two choices: accept their offer or run. Running would be difficult. He'd have to convince Angie to flee with him. They would need new identities. That was doable. He knew where to purchase such documents from his work with Grimm. But what was the point? Grimm could easily find out his new identity from those who supplied the IDs. Martin slumped in his chair. He had no room to maneuver, no escape. He was up the proverbial creek without a paddle. Accepting his setback, the inspector proceeded. He detailed the witness protection procedures while Martin listened attentively. Martin asked several questions but was disappointed with the answers. He wasn't convinced things would unfold as described. Yet, for every question he posed, the inspector had a response. Then Martin asked the question that shifted his entire perspective on the situation. So where would Angie and I be going? He inquired innocently. The inspector looked at him in surprise. Before I agree to this, I need to discuss it with her, and we both need to decide where we'll go. I know you mentioned we wouldn't be told our destination, but I have to ensure she's okay with it, Martin said carefully. You can't be serious. She's the last person who should know where you are, exclaimed Gray. Martin stared at him incredulously. You don't know? The inspector asked. Martin slowly shook his head. Wait here, Gray said as he left the room. He returned with some printed documents and handed them to Martin. Sign these and then I'll show you something. Martin read through the papers carefully, signed one and returned the other unsigned. The date is wrong by over 3 months. It's dated last January, he explained. The inspector looked annoyed. Just sign it, will you? Martin didn't move to comply. Listen, we have court orders to tap phones and bug nearly every property associated with Mr. Francois Grimard. Despite all this, we've failed to gather any valuable information. Everything we've found portrays him as a model citizen. I know he's bribing someone to keep him informed about the investigation. Martin said nothing. We realized he was using you for more than bookkeeping, and I had just started filling out paperwork to get a court order to bug your house when I decided I needed a different approach. Lowering his voice to a whisper, he continued, I broke the law. I hired a shady private investigator to bug your house from the date on that form. I thought if he didn't know it was bugged, he might slip up. I was right. He's practically running his illegal operations from your home and 2 other unsuspecting women's houses. Martin felt both intrigued and apprehensive about what he was about to hear. Go on. I need you to sign this contract. It will essentially legitimize things, Gray said, sliding the papers toward him. Martin made no move to sign them. We, or rather I, have discovered many things about Francois, his business, your wife, and of course you, Martin. Martin's face turned scarlet. He was both angry and ashamed. Angry at the invasion of his privacy. Ashamed because he knew what had transpired in his marriage over the past 6 months. "Martin, when was the last time you were close with your wife?" Gray inquired. "You seem to already know," Martin replied with frustration. "It was a week ago, Monday, when I returned from an overseas trip." Gray leaned forward. "Martin, let's cut to the chase. Your wife suspects you're being unfaithful. Why do you think that is?" Martin hesitated, fidgeting with his hands. "She thinks I'm cheating on her." "And where do you think she got that idea?" Gray pressed. "I don't know," Martin mumbled. "Maybe it's just her imagination." Gray sighed, tapping a stack of unsigned documents. "Martin, there's more going on here than you realize. Just sign the papers." Martin glanced at the documents but didn't move. Gray leaned in, lowering his voice. "Your wife has been spending time with someone else, Martin. Every time you've been away, she's had someone else in your home." The weight of Gray's words hit Martin like a punch to the stomach. He paled and bent over, retching. Gray stepped back, waiting for Martin to regain composure before quietly leaving the room. Moments later, he returned with a bucket, mop, and a glass of water. Once the mess was cleaned and Martin had steadied himself, Gray placed a laptop in front of him. "You need to see this. I'm sorry." Martin hesitated, then looked at the screen. It displayed a live feed from his home. His heart sank as he recognized his bedroom and the people inside it. The clarity of the image felt cruel as it revealed undeniable evidence of betrayal. Martin's hands trembled, and his breath quickened. Gray placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Martin, you don't have to watch anymore. You've seen enough. Let's move forward with what needs to be done." For several moments, Martin stared blankly at the screen. Finally, he straightened up, took a deep breath, and signed the documents. As Martin wondered what she planned to do, Angie moved away from the bed. "You seem to really like your salad dressing," she said with a light chuckle, picking up the plate and heading downstairs. The surveillance system tracked her movements, switching between cameras and rooms as she descended to the kitchen. Martin watched as she prepared a mixed salad, adding herbs and carefully arranging it back on the plate. The unsettling grin on her face made him uneasy. "I'm truly sorry you had to experience this," said Inspector Gray. "No one deserves to be treated that way." Martin stayed silent, struggling to process everything. "Anything," he finally muttered hoarsely. "Whatever you need, just get me out of this." Gray nodded, understanding the weight of his words. He had needed Martin to see the reality to gain his cooperation in taking down François Grimard. Martin trembled with anger. The feelings he once had for Angie had turned into bitterness and regret. He couldn't believe how blind he had been. "I need to ask," Martin said hesitantly. "What's the syringe about?" Gray looked at him with hesitation, then handed him a laptop. A video file played, showing Martin returning home, eating the salad Angie had prepared, and interacting with her in ways that now felt manipulative. The realization hit him hard, and he turned away from the screen. "I've seen enough," Martin said, pushing the laptop back. "Just tell me what to do." "First, I need to know if you can go home and act like everything is fine," Gray said seriously. Martin hesitated. "It won't be easy, but I won't give her any reason to suspect me." "You realize your safety might depend on it," Gray added firmly. Martin nodded, his resolve hardening. "At this point, I don't care about myself. I just want to see her and Grimard brought to justice." "Good," Gray said. "We'll make a plan. You'll be reported as missing, supposedly killed while trying to escape in Holland. After that, you'll be in protective custody until the trial ends. Once it's over, you'll get a fresh start." Martin looked down, his hands clenched into fists. "Let's do it." After a moment, Martin asked, "Can I leave now?" Inspector Gray considered the request. "Yes, but you'll need a plausible excuse for being late," he said, nodding as he walked to the door. "I think being held up at customs will do," Martin replied, following him. "Yes, quite a long delay," Gray said thoughtfully, then added with a hint of sarcasm, "and yet you managed to bring all your goods through." Martin stopped abruptly. "What? You detained me for hours, turned my life upside down, and now you want to take my perfectly legal belongings too?" he exclaimed. "For the greater good," Gray replied calmly with a knowing smile. The rest of their walk to Martin's car was filled with tense silence. Martin was shocked to find his car emptied. His clothes and other belongings were piled haphazardly near the trunk, and his contraband was carefully stacked on a trolley beside them. "Sorry, all for appearances. We don't think you have a chaperone, but we can't be sure," Gray explained. Martin picked up his clothes, tossed them into his suitcase, opened the trunk, and placed it inside. "See you soon," offered the inspector. "Get lost," Martin replied and got into his car. He didn't even light a cigarette before driving off. "We will be watching you at home, but we can't be with you everywhere." "Good luck," said Gray, trying to show some support. He knew the next week and a half would be very difficult for the man. Martin drove off, seething with anger. He was fed up with everything: his life, his wife, the delay, Mr. Frankie not-so-big Grimm, and, as he saw it, that thieving cop. He paid little attention to his speed on the way home. What was the point? He would be gone in 10 days' time. An hour later, he pulled into his driveway. The usually reassuring crunch of the gravel under his wheels only fueled his frustration. He turned off the engine and sat for a few moments to gather himself before getting out and retrieving his suitcase. He locked the car and, with a deep breath, headed inside. "Hello, dear. You're later than I expected." Her voice was frosty. Martin glared at her, remembering Gray's instruction to behave normally. "I said you're late," she repeated, her tone like that of a schoolmistress chastising a pupil. "Yes, I heard you. Thanks for stating the obvious," he snapped back. "I've been held up by customs, if you must know, and they robbed me." "There's no need to take that tone with me." "Isn't there? Well, let me tell you now, Missy, I've had it up to here." He was almost shouting now, holding his hand above his head. "I'm tired of all this traveling, customs, and moreover, I'm done with all this nonsense you keep giving me about everything. You keep accusing me of being unfaithful. Well, listen up. The last woman I was with was you, and that was a long time ago. Now what have you got for me to eat?" Angie's eyes widened in shock. Martin had never shouted at her, never raised his voice. He rarely used harsh words, and never before had he directed them at her. There's a salad in the fridge for—" "That's another thing I've had enough of," he shouted, walking into the kitchen. He yanked open the fridge door, pulled out the salad and dumped it into the bin, plate and all. He turned to her. "Now, cook me something proper." "I will not," she shouted back angrily. "In fact, I will do nothing for you until you apologize." The sound of the slap echoed through the house. "Now, get me something to eat, or you can leave my house right now. I told you I'm fed up, and one of the things I'm fed up with is your attitude towards me." Still rubbing her cheek, she knew he was serious and began bustling around. Looking in the freezer, she found very little suitable for a quick meal. "Would bacon, eggs, and some of your black pudding be all right?" she sobbed, now frightened of this man, her husband who had walked through the door 15 minutes earlier, the man she thought she knew, the man she suddenly found herself liking a little more than she had earlier. "Yes, but no salad, okay?" Angie nodded, wiping tears with her wrist. Martin poured himself a hefty glass of scotch and returned to the kitchen, where Angie was thawing a pack of bacon in water. "How about some chips and maybe grilled tomatoes?" she suggested. "That would be lovely," he replied, Taking a seat with the daily newspaper? Actually, instead of tomatoes, I'll have beans. Angie held her tongue, fighting back a wave of emotion. Normally, they'd be sharing their usual relaxed meals, but today was different. Part of her felt a strange sense of relief, noticing a different side of Martin. She switched on the fryer and began peeling potatoes for the chips as it warmed up. Before long, Martin was enjoying his breakfast. Twice fried chips, 2 thick slices of bread generously buttered, and his favorite black pudding. He had learned the art of making black pudding from his father, a butcher, and always preferred his homemade version. Every so often he even supplied it to a few regular customers. "Thank you, dear. That's probably the best meal you've cooked for me in over 6 months," he said, placing his knife and fork neatly on the plate. "Why don't you head upstairs and freshen up? It's time we started acting like a team again," he added, his tone surprisingly cheerful. Angie hesitated for a moment, glancing toward her handbag with a mixture of unease and resignation. She flushed slightly but didn't reach for it, quietly leaving the room. Martin lingered for a moment before checking her handbag. His expression hardened as he confirmed what he already suspected. "I should have done this months ago," he muttered to himself. Upstairs, Angie sat on the edge of the bed, deep in thought. She couldn't shake the tension that had grown between them in recent months. Her choices, her secrets, everything was catching up to her. She replayed moments in her mind, questioning how she had gotten to this point. As Martin joined her, his demeanor was calm, almost detached. He spoke to her firmly but without anger, addressing the changes they needed to make. Angie listened, torn between guilt and an unexpected feeling of hope. For the first time in a long while, Martin's words carried a sense of purpose. Later, as Angie washed up in the bathroom, she reflected on their conversation. She couldn't deny the cracks in their relationship, but for the first time she considered the possibility of repairing them. François Grimard, her ill-advised distraction, had led her down a dangerous road. What had started as a thrill had turned into a burden, a weight she could no longer carry. She realized she had been naive to think it could end well. Standing before the mirror, she took a deep breath. It wasn't too late to turn things around, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The choices ahead were daunting, and the stakes had never been higher. When her thoughts shifted to the things Frankie had convinced her to do, she froze. The weight of her actions filled her with regret as she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She gazed at the face, staring back at her. Time had been kind. She had thought herself still beautiful. Now the face she saw looked worn and burdened by guilt. She wasn't sure how long she stayed in the bathroom, only that she had composed herself and washed her face a second time before returning to bed. She found her husband asleep on his back. She moved closer to him, as he had asked her to do earlier, showing care and tenderness. She remained by his side, unsure whether he was fully awake, as he didn't utter a word or sound the entire time. The following morning he embraced her while they sat together on the sofa. They shared a quiet moment of connection, something that had been missing in their relationship for years. Both silently wished they had treated each other with this kindness throughout their marriage. Each understood, in their own way, that the decisions they now faced might not have been necessary if things had been different. Martin left for work, feeling a renewed sense of calm for the first time in nearly a year. As he walked to his car, he reminded himself to maintain his usual demeanor. He needed to keep up the appearance of a husband who had been worn down by circumstances, still trying to rebuild his life. As he drove to work, he reflected on what he once believed he had, how it had been lost, and the role that François Grimard, a manipulative figure, had played in their story. By the time he reached his office, the anger he had felt the previous night resurfaced, etching a gloomy scowl on his face. The weight of his recent actions, especially concerning the near future, pressed heavily on his shoulders. Only those who knew him well might notice any difference. To others, he appeared as the usual sad, frustrated man, hunched over as if trying to hide from his own insignificance. Just before noon, Charles Chiswick questioned him about his delay at the port. If Martin hadn't been aware of what he now knew, he would have wondered both why Charles was interested and how he found out. He still pondered over how Charles knew. Back in his office, Martin contemplated the possibilities. The first and most likely was that his wife had mentioned something to someone. The second and third options were that his car or house were equipped with electronic surveillance beyond what he was already aware of. Perhaps he or his home were being watched, or that persistent detective had a mole in his department. His blood ran cold at that last thought. If that were the case, he could be in serious trouble. Once this idea struck him, it wouldn't leave. Why hadn't he gotten a contact number for that detective? Even a name might have helped, he thought to himself. He managed to devise some ideas to ease his mind on certain points, but the possibility of a mole was something he couldn't resolve. It didn't matter whether it was true or not. Every time a door slammed or a loud noise sounded, Martin would jump. As he drove home that evening, he imagined danger at every traffic light, perceived a threat in every passing car. Even the sight of a police vehicle offered no reassurance. He arrived home without incident, but was still filled with unease as he crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him. For the first time in many years, Angie greeted him warmly. She hurried to him, wrapping her arms around him in a way that felt surprisingly tender. Her smile seemed genuine, and she lingered close, almost as if trying to bridge the emotional distance that had grown between them. "Something smells delicious. What's for dinner?" he asked, steering the interaction into safer territory. Angie hesitated for a moment, her smile faltering. "Steak and ale pie, mashed veggies and gravy," she replied. Her expression suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. She quickly excused herself and hurried upstairs, leaving Martin standing there, feeling a mix of confusion and guilt. He gazed up the stairs, debating whether to follow her, but the thought of their recent struggles held him back. Instead, he searched for her handbag, more out of nervous habit than suspicion. Finding nothing out of place, he set it down and tried to refocus. The enticing aroma of food filled the house, but his appetite was gone. He retreated to the living room, poured himself a scotch, and turned on the television. The sound of her footsteps descending the stairs soon followed, and he heard her busying herself in the kitchen. Martin sat on the couch, staring at the television without really watching it. He couldn't shake the sense that he had mishandled things again. Lighting a cigarette, he reflected on how he had been advised to act as though everything was normal. He thought about Angie's sudden change in behavior. Was it an attempt at reconciliation, or something else entirely? Either way, he appreciated the effort, even if it left him feeling unsettled. When she finally called him in to eat, he poured himself another scotch and joined her in the kitchen. As he gazed at one of his favorite dishes, a meal she hadn't prepared for him in over 2 years, he felt a pang of nostalgia. The realization of how much time had passed stirred complex emotions. The distance between them in their marriage felt like a heavy weight, and he couldn't help but wonder how they had drifted so far apart. Taking a cautious bite, he was pleasantly surprised by how delicious it was. The flavors were better than he remembered, and for a moment he allowed himself to enjoy the simple comfort of a home-cooked meal. "Is everything all right?" she asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. He nodded, offering her a small smile. "It's really good. It feels like ages since we had dinner like this together. I've missed this and us." Her face lit up with a smile he hadn't seen in a long time, and it warmed him. For a moment it felt like the barriers between them had softened, and he wondered if they could rebuild what they once had. As the evening progressed, their conversation became lighter, filled with memories of happier times. They laughed over shared stories, and for the first time in months, the tension between them eased. Martin couldn't help but think that perhaps this dinner was the first step toward mending their relationship. Later that evening, she mentioned a job opportunity that her friend Charlotte had told her about. Charlotte said there's an opening with her boss, François Grimard. She thinks I'd be a good fit and offered to put in a word for me. Martin's mind raced. He had heard about Grimard before and wasn't comfortable with the idea of his wife working for him. Still, he didn't want to overreact. "We're managing fine right now," he said carefully. "I'd rather you focus on what makes you happy here at home. But if it's something you really want, we can talk about it." Her expression wavered for a moment before she nodded. "I was just thinking it might give us more stability, and maybe more time together if you didn't have to travel so much for work." He hesitated, not wanting to squash her hopes but unsure of how to feel about her suggestion. "Let's see how things go. Maybe we can find another way to make that happen." As the night wore on, the two of them sat together, reconnecting in small but meaningful ways. For Martin, it wasn't a perfect evening, but it was a start, a reminder of the bond they once shared and the possibility of finding their way back to each other. As she approached Martin, Angie felt a growing tension between them. They moved toward the bed, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Gently, she placed her hands on his shoulders, guiding him to sit. There was an undeniable connection, but it was clouded by the complexity of their feelings. Martin reclined, closing his eyes, trying to focus on the moment, yet his thoughts kept drifting. Angie's gaze softened, and she tried to ease his tension with a comforting touch. She wanted to bring them closer, to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. But as she reached out, he stopped her, shaking his head gently. "We need to talk," he said firmly, his voice a mix of frustration and sorrow. Angie hesitated, her heart sinking. She sat beside him, folding her hands nervously. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've made mistakes, Martin, but I want to fix this." Martin looked away, his expression unreadable. "Angie, it's not just about fixing things. It's about honesty, respect, and trust. Do you even realize what you've done?" Tears welled up in Angie's eyes as she nodded. "I do, and I hate myself for it. I didn't think it would spiral out of control like this." Martin stood abruptly, pacing the room. "Spiral out of control? Angie, you betrayed me. You lied to me and broke our vows. How do you expect me to just move past that?" Angie flinched at his words, knowing they were true. She had allowed herself to be manipulated, caught up in a situation she could no longer control. And now, she was terrified of losing the one person who had always been her anchor. "I don't know what else to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I love you, Martin, I do, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove it to you." Martin stopped pacing and turned to face her. He wanted to believe her, but the pain was still too fresh. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "Angie, I don't know if I can ever trust you again, but for now I need space. I need time to think." Angie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. Just please, don't give up on us." Later that evening, Angie sat alone, replaying the events of the past few months in her mind. She had allowed herself to be controlled by someone who cared nothing for her well-being. She knew she had to end it, but Frank's threats loomed large in her mind. "Listen, Angie," Frank had said during their last call, his tone icy. "You belong to me now. If you don't do what I say, I'll make sure Martin finds out everything and more. You don't want that, do you?" Angie's hands shook as she recalled his words. She had been desperate to end the affair, but Frank's calm, calculated threats left her paralyzed with fear. Now, hearing Martin's car pull up outside, she knew she had to find the courage to come clean. It was the only way to truly free herself from the mess she had created. As Martin walked through the door, Angie braced herself. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "There's something I need to tell you." Martin paused, his expression unreadable. "I hope you're ready to tell me the truth," he replied. As Martin drove home, a new idea struck him just as he was leaving the office. Now he was figuring out what he needed to bring it to life. He parked outside his house and sat for a moment, mentally reviewing the final details. A smile crossed his face. It was brilliant in its simplicity, with only one complication. If it worked, he'd be in the clear. If not, he'd have to follow the plan laid out by his anonymous cop. As he inserted his key into the lock, he heard footsteps on the stairs, and upon entering, he noticed the shower had just started running. Did I just miss a visit from Frankie? He wondered. He was making tea when she came downstairs. Looking at her, he asked, "Your eyes are red. Have you been crying?" "No," she replied defensively. "I got soap in my eyes." "A bit late for a shower," he remarked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I had a rough night. Slept in. I haven't been up long, so—" "Why are you home?" she responded. "I was feeling sick, so I came home," he said, scanning the room for any signs she might have had company. He found none. "I think I'll go lie down for a while." As he spoke, he watched for any signs of guilt or hesitation, clues that she didn't want him to see a freshly used bed. He saw both guilt and fear, and felt a bit more of the love he once had slip away. He was relieved to find that although the bed was unmade, there were no indications of recent infidelity. He straightened the quilt and lay down on it. He stayed upstairs for about an hour, trying to resolve the one complication in his plan. It would be easy if he didn't have a chaperone, as the nameless cop had called it. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way around that. The only solution he could think of required a change in his usual routine, and he had a valid excuse for that. Clapping his hands with excitement, he jumped up from the bed, pulled out 2 suitcases, and began packing. After packing the second suitcase, he went downstairs to his wife and noticed the traces of tears on her face. "You've been crying," he said gently. "Are you feeling okay?" She hesitated but then nodded, grateful for the moment of understanding. "I think we should take a short trip," he suggested. "We need a change of scenery, some time to reconnect. Lately, it feels like we've been out of sync. Maybe a little time away will help us find our balance again." Her eyes brightened for a moment, but concern quickly returned. How long would we be gone?" "I'll call Charles to see if he can help manage things while I'm away. If he can, I'll aim to take a full week off. If not, we can still leave tomorrow night and return on Sunday. Either way, we'll make it work." He paused, letting her consider the options. "So, what do you think? Should we go for a few days or try for something longer?" She mulled it over. A week away seemed unlikely, but even a few days felt like a much-needed escape from the stress and endless worries that had weighed her down recently. "Yes, please. That sounds perfect. Where do you think we should go?" "Let's decide once I know how much time I can get off," he said with a small smile. "I made some tea earlier. It's probably gone cold by now." "I'll make a fresh pot," she offered, reaching for the kettle, a faint glimmer of hope in her voice. As they enjoyed their tea, they discussed potential destinations and activities they'd like to experience, both reminiscing about how things used to be between them while concealing their own secrets and agendas. Martin waited until shortly after 3:30 before phoning Charles Chiswick. "Hello, Charles, it's Martin. Curtis mentioned you went home sick. Are you feeling better?" "Somewhat, still feeling a bit nauseous. I think it's best if I take tomorrow off as well. But I was wondering if I could take next week off as a holiday. Angie and I have been talking, and we'd like to get away for a few days. That should be fine with me. Hold on, I'll check with Curtis to make sure he doesn't have anything planned for you. Martin heard muffled voices and assumed Charles had covered the mouthpiece. After a couple of minutes, Charles returned. We'll need you back by the end of next week, so we'll see you on Thursday. Goodbye. Martin was still not accustomed to how both Charles and Curtis ended calls, saying goodbye and hanging up without giving the other person a chance to respond. He turned to Angie. We're coming home on Wednesday. Angie forced a smile. She had hoped there might be a way out of her dilemma. I suppose that means you'll be heading to Europe again, she suggested. He didn't say, he replied, though both knew he didn't need to. Martin brought the suitcases down from the bedroom and locked them in the trunk. I didn't realize you'd already packed. Do you want to leave right away? Angie asked. Ready when you are, he answered. I'll just use the bathroom, she said. As soon as she was out of sight, he quickly checked her handbag, relieved not to find anything unusual. He took out her phone and discreetly placed it under a chair. After closing her bag, he carried it out to the car. On his way back inside, she met him at the door. Have you seen my handbag? She asked. Yes, I just put it in the car, he replied. Then, with a smile, he pulled her close for a brief hug, masking his continued concern about their situation. Martin enjoyed driving and took pride in his navigation skills. He followed a route heading north and west until he connected with the A1 at Retford. From there, they drove for a few hours before stopping at a hotel for the night. Conversation during the drive was minimal, each lost in their own thoughts. Angie was preoccupied with finding a way out of her current predicament, while Martin was processing his feelings of frustration and betrayal. Once they reached their hotel, they settled in quietly. Angie requested a break from any strenuous activity, mentioning she was tired from the day's journey. Martin respected her request, and they both focused on simply unwinding. The next morning they showered, packed their belongings, and had an early breakfast, aiming to cover more miles before traffic increased. Their next stop was Rosslyn Chapel, a place they had visited years earlier. They admired its restored beauty and reflected on how much it had changed. Later that afternoon, they drove into Edinburgh. Despite an oil warning light on the car dashboard, Martin ignored it, determined to stick to their plan. In the city, they enjoyed sightseeing, including a tour of the castle and a ghost walk along the Royal Mile, before returning to their hotel for dinner. Martin sampled several local whiskies, and Angie had to assist him back to their room afterward. That night, there was no rush to start early the next morning. The following day, after a late checkout, Martin encouraged another walk around the city. Angie assumed it was for him to recover from the previous night, but he had a different agenda. While she admired the displays of a nearby hair salon, Martin suggested she treat herself, and she agreed. While Angie was getting her hair done, Martin visited his bank to withdraw funds and finalize plans he had made earlier. Later, they resumed their journey northward. Martin continued to ignore the car's oil warning light, dismissing Angie's concerns about the noisy engine. Near Junction 2 on the M90, the engine failed dramatically, leaving them stranded. Only then did Angie realize she had forgotten her phone. Martin called for roadside assistance, casually suggesting she might have misplaced her phone somewhere. Soon, a technician arrived and confirmed the engine had suffered from a lack of oil. Martin remained unfazed, as it was a company car, and arranged for a rental vehicle. Within hours, they were back on the road in a nearly new Toyota Auris. Their final destination was a small, isolated croft in the Grampian Mountains. The property, surrounded by wilderness, was tucked away miles from the nearest town. Angie questioned the secrecy of the plan, but Martin simply smiled. Inside, they discovered a well-stocked larder and basic furnishings, enough to sustain them for an extended stay. In the quiet and seclusion of the croft, they spent the next few days reconnecting. They took long walks, admired the stars, and talked about their shared memories. The stillness of the location offered them a chance to reflect and rebuild their bond, rediscovering a sense of partnership they had both missed. Martin's phone reminder indicated it was Wednesday morning. As he switched off the alert, he swallowed hard. The moment had arrived to confront her, to reveal what he knew. He brewed a pot of tea and brought it to the bedroom where she lay, her cheeks flushed from recent intimacy. "Ooh, sweetie, thank you," she purred. "Angie, there's something I need to tell you," he blurted out. She looked at him, noticing the discomfort on his face. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked. "I know, Angie," he replied. "Know what, darling?" she asked, fearful of his answer. "Everything, Angie, all of it. What you've been doing with that man, and what he had planned for you this weekend." He choked back a sob. "And what makes it even worse is how you've been treating me." "Oh God, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to end things with him, but he keeps insisting that he wants me to." She curled up on the bed, tears streaming down her face. "I'm leaving you here. He won't be able to find you. There's plenty of food, and I'll be back sometime after the weekend. Maybe a few days later," he stated. "In the meantime, you have decisions to make, whether you want to stay married to me or not. While I'm gone, you can write a full confession. I want to know the whys, the whats, and the whens. I'll read it when I come to get you, and then I'll decide if I want to stay with you." As he reached the door, he added curtly, "Don't try to go anywhere. You'll get lost and die. Goodbye." Martin got up and left her crying on the bed. She didn't move until darkness fell. While she chastised herself, Martin headed south solemnly. As soon as his phone regained signal, it started chiming with incoming texts. He pulled over to read them. One informed him that his car was repaired and ready for pickup. Two were from the brothers, reminding him he was due back on Thursday. Another was from Curtis asking how he was enjoying Dunfermline. Martin smiled all the way to Dunfermline to retrieve his car. He now knew it was fitted with a tracker, so a chaperone was unlikely. He picked up his car and paid with his credit card. Apparently, the oil sump had cracked. It looked almost as if someone had deliberately damaged it using a jack, the mechanic told him, as Martin moved a suitcase and a heavy bag from the Auris to his own car. He then drove the Auris back to the rental place, arriving just before closing. One of their staff gave him a ride back to his car after he paid again with his credit card. Soon he was heading south again, stopping only once more at a service station for a break, some coffee, and to use the facilities. He arrived home just after 10:30, having stopped at his local chip shop to pick up fish and chips to eat at home. He washed down his meal with a beer, a cigarette, and a second beer served as dessert. As he crumpled up the paper his dinner had come in, he remembered her phone. He reached under the chair for it. There were several missed calls from Charlotte and more from an unrecognized number, not recognized by her phone, but one Martin knew. It was the number that usually called him about 2 hours before he set off for Europe, sometimes the day before. There were several more calls from her friends, and multiple texts from Charlotte asking where she was or urging her to call. Other friends had sent similar messages, and one from a number neither her phone nor Martin recognized read, "Friday 7 p.m. 4 guests make dinner, no pork." Bastard, he thought angrily. Then he smirked, knowing he had disrupted those plans. He wondered if there was some way to upset Frankie Grimard even more. An idea came to him, and he went to sleep with a smile on his face. Angie had cried from the moment Martin left, until she had no tears left. Now all she had for company were her own regret and desolation. Martin woke up at 6 o'clock, an hour earlier than usual. At 6:30 he made a phone call. "Hello, mate. Hope I'm not calling too early," Martin said. "Hello, mate. Yes, you're early. About 2 weeks early, if you ask me, the voice on the other end replied. Got someone you need to get rid of? Martin chuckled at his friend's joke, always wondering how he'd react if he ever said yes. No, not just yet. Maybe soon. In the meantime, I'm doing something for some of Angie's friends. How soon can I get some? Today, if you want. The usual amount. Any chance of, He hesitated for a moment. You know what? Make it 2 gallons. Really? Really. Can do. When will you be over? Tonight. Might be a bit later than usual. Is that okay? Of course it is. See you later. Yes, mate. See you tonight. Martin hung up and took a shower. He left early enough to stop by a DIY shop on his way to work. Finding what he needed was easy, so he arrived at work ahead of schedule. Feeling happy, he made sure everyone noticed. You seem happy today, Martin, Curtis observed as he entered Martin's office. Yes, Angie and I have had a great few days. We haven't been getting along lately, but we've sorted things out now. Thanks for asking, he said cheerfully. In fact, we're going away again for the weekend starting tomorrow night. Well, that's good, Curtis said. Have you heard from Mr. Grimard this week? No, why? Has he said anything to you? No. That's a shame. I could have taken her with me. She'd love to see Amsterdam or Brussels. Curtis left without making any of his usual condescending remarks. 5 minutes later, Martin's phone rang. Martin, I need you to go to Brussels tomorrow morning. This one's a bit different. After you've made your usual delivery, I need you to stay over the weekend and bring back a package on Monday. It needs to be extra hush-hush, so no taking the good lady with you for a dirty weekend, okay? The voice on the phone said rapidly, leaving no room for interruption. Yes, Mr. Grimard. Usual time and place for the pickup on this end? Martin asked. No, can you pick up early? 6 o'clock in the morning? You'll be called with the details for the other job, Mr. Grimard informed him, then hung up. Martin stared at the receiver as the dial tone buzzed. The rudeness of the Grim still infuriated him after all these years. I wonder if the guests tomorrow are my employers. No matter. Whoever they are, they won't be happy 5 minutes after entering my house, he thought. Without actually hanging up the phone, he booked himself and his car on the Eurostar, departing at 9:15 a.m. from Folkestone. Then he began searching for a reasonably priced bed and breakfast to stay in over the weekend. He left work early at 4 o'clock, driving to a large chain toy store. From there, he drove to Graham the pig farmer. After finishing his business with Graham, he loaded 2-gallon containers of pig's blood into the trunk of his car and headed down the lane back to the main road. As Martin navigated the road, his headlights suddenly revealed a car parked in his lane with no lights on, blocking his path. A surge of fear washed over him, and sweat began to trickle down his face. He inched forward cautiously, straining to see if there was any way around, but the car obstructed the entire lane. Leaning forward, he tried to determine if anyone was inside, but it seemed deserted. Just as he shifted into reverse and muttered a curse, his door was abruptly pulled open. Mr. Stein, we meet again. Though he could only discern a silhouette, Martin instantly recognized the voice. Inspector, he exclaimed, a wave of relief washing over him. Apologies for the covert approach, but we've noticed something concerning. There are now more listening devices in your home and office than the ones we placed, the inspector informed him. What about my car? Martin asked. We checked it while it was being repaired. There's a tracker installed, but nothing else. By the way, what have you done with your wife? The policeman inquired. She's in Scotland, taking time to reflect on her actions. I was hoping you'd send someone to find her after my, unfortunate accident, Martin replied. She has enough supplies to last at least 2 more weeks, maybe over a month. She's safe where she is for now. You're a better man than I am, the inspector mused. Part of him had wished for a harsher fate for her betrayal, though he preferred to avoid the resulting paperwork. Tomorrow you'll travel along the A16 and E40 to Nieuwe Stalestraat in St. Petersleeuw, Belgium. Take exit 18 Roosbroek from the E19. At some point, you'll be pulled over and a tragic accident will occur. Understood? The inspector pronounced the French and Belgian names effortlessly, like a native speaker. Martin nodded in agreement. I was wondering, I'm concerned that someone might break into my house tomorrow. Could you ensure the culprits are apprehended? For some reason, I suspect the burglary will happen a little after 7. Martin asked hesitantly. He added, but please don't let any officers enter until they've heard a loud bang. That won't be a problem. See you on the other side, the inspector said as he headed back to his car. The inspector reversed into a passing spot and Martin drove past, feeling reassured by their encounter. Upon returning home, Martin unloaded his purchases and began preparing a surprise for his wife's associates. First, he emptied the rat poison and ground it into a fine pulp using a blender, then mixed it into the pig's blood. Hopefully, this will slow down or even prevent clotting, he thought, shaking each container to ensure the mixture was even. He then unrolled some lightweight plastic tubing, connecting one end to the compressor in his garage. He ran the tubing through an air vent from his kitchen into the living room. Next, he installed a switch that would be triggered when the front door opened. After conducting several test runs to confirm everything worked properly, he added the final touches and went to bed. He woke up at 5 in the morning to his alarm. After getting dressed and having a cup of coffee, he made the final adjustments to ensure his plan would succeed. Double-checking that everything was set, he kicked in his own front door, breaking the lock. Wedging it closed from the inside, he set the trap and exited through the back door. He then drove off to collect his package. At 8:30 in the morning, he was lined up to drive his car onto the train. Using his wife's phone, he sent a text message. Let yourself in. Might have to step out for half an hour. Then he removed the battery. 15 minutes later, he was seated in his car aboard one of the Eurostar carriages. After a glance behind him, he picked up the briefcase from the footwell beside him. If his hunch was correct, this would be one of 4 identical cases, each of which he had learned the combination to on previous trips, a pastime to occupy his mind during the dull ferry crossings. On his 3rd attempt, the lock clicked open. Martin took a deep breath with each lock that opened, then surreptitiously checked his surroundings to ensure the occupants of the cars ahead and behind weren't watching. Inside the case, he found the expected bag, which he removed before closing the briefcase. Sweating heavily, he once again checked both ahead and behind before placing the case back in the footwell. He waited for his trembling hands to steady before looking inside the small velvet bag. He exhaled sharply upon seeing its glittering contents. His heart racing, he reached into his jacket for his wallet, pulling it out as he tried to calm himself. After taking several deep breaths, he opened his wallet and took out a small foil packet. A few minutes later, still with shaking hands, he tore open the packet and removed the con-arm inside. He unrolled it a couple of inches and had to pause again to regain his composure. One by one, Martin transferred the contents of the velvet pouch into the con-arm. After tying a knot, he tore off the excess material. Using a juice pouch, he managed to swallow the con-arm. Just over an hour after boarding the train, he was driving off. 20 minutes later, he had cleared customs and was heading toward Belgium on the A16 highway. About 2 hours later, he was pulled over. "Sir, quickly!" a man with a French accent said urgently, almost dragging him from his car toward a waiting van. Martin was thrown through the side door and the van sped away rapidly. He estimated they had moved no more than 200 yards when he heard the sickening crash of a car being hit by something large and heavy, followed 30 seconds later by the distant thump of igniting fuel. "Sir, life over death, yes?" The Frenchman smiled at him, his breath thick with garlic. The rest of Martin's journey was uneventful, except for changing vehicles twice, both times discreetly. None of his brief traveling companions attempted conversation. Just over 3 hours later, he was being ushered through a door in a back alley. He had no idea where he was. He was pushed toward a set of stairs, which he climbed obediently. There was one door at the top. It opened as he approached. "Come in, Martin," greeted a familiar voice. Martin said nothing, feeling more than a little overwhelmed by the events since he had been pulled over. "You were stopped for a routine traffic check. One of your brake lights was faulty. Unfortunately, you were hit by a large truck hauling steel. I'm afraid you were killed on impact. Your body is only identifiable through DNA and dental records. I'm sorry to say your wife is now a widow," the man said, his voice full of a peculiar pride. Martin sat quietly, only now truly grasping that his former life was over. Everything he had known before that morning was gone. There was a knock at the door. A man entered, spoke to the officer in hushed tones, and then left. "It appears we reached you just in time. The case you picked up this morning had nothing of value in it. We've also discovered that a contract has been taken out on you. We don't think you were meant to return from this trip." Martin was stunned. "You mean if you weren't already dead, you soon would be," the inspector confirmed. Martin's face went pale and he began to tremble. The inspector pulled a hip flask from his pocket, unscrewed the top, and handed it to Martin. "Here, take this." Martin lifted the flask, inhaled its aroma, and took a deep swallow of the brandy inside. The warmth spread from his mouth down into his chest, helping to numb the shock of the news he had just received. Internally, he was elated. They believed the case was empty when he left. His loyalty to Angie had made him consider taking her with him, but his anger wanted her to suffer. He was torn, desiring both outcomes. No, what he truly wished was that none of it had happened. Eventually he concluded that at least she would grieve his supposed death, possibly blaming herself or her associate. That would be her punishment, and it would have to suffice. Martin was handed a file and informed that this was his new identity. He simply stared at it. "You need to learn most, if not all, of what's inside that folder," the policeman said. The officer then spent some time explaining what would transpire over the next couple of weeks before Martin transitioned into his new life. He pulled out a laptop. "I thought you might like to keep an eye on your old house. It's nearly 7 back home." Martin retrieved his wife's phone and reinserted the battery. The laptop screen lit up, and the inspector clicked a few times, opening several windows that displayed different views from inside or outside Martin's former residence. In one window, a black Bentley arrived, and 4 men exited the car: Frank, Curtis, and 2 unfamiliar men. They approached the door, disappearing from the screen's view. Martin selected the window showing his front door from the inside. He heard the doorbell and saw shadows through the glass. The door burst open, and Martin heard the anticipated hum begin, making him smile. He heard Frank speak in an unfamiliar language. Since Frank's family was from Senegal, he assumed it was their native tongue. Curtis exclaimed, "Wow, Frank, you don't know your own strength. You've broken the door." "No, that wasn't me," Martin heard Frank reply. "She should be here. She hasn't answered her phone all day. We'll deal with her later. Come on." Frank led them through to the living room, unaware of the faint hum coming from the garage. They entered the living room, and the electronic observer switched views. The 3 men took seats while Curtis moved toward the stocked drinks. How they all failed to notice the expanding orange balloon in the corner near the door remains one of life's unsolved mysteries. Curtis spotted it first, as he was bringing drinks to his companions. "What the heck is, Curtis began. Bang! It was an incredibly loud noise. Anyone outside might have thought it was gunfire or an explosion. It was everything Martin had hoped for. The space hopper, already filled with 2 gallons of pig's blood, had been inflated until it burst, dousing the occupants and the living room in red. Curtis was not pleased, and the others were angrily shouting. Martin sent a text to Frank from his wife's phone, PIGBLOODPIG. If Frank had been upset before reading that message, he was furious afterward. He shouted something incomprehensible before the door burst open again, and 6 armed officers rushed in, forcing all 4 to the floor at gunpoint and arresting them. Martin and his companion laughed heartily at the spectacle unfolding on the screen. "What on earth was that?" demanded the policeman. "Pig's blood. Nice touch, don't you think?" "Laugh all you want. If you weren't already dead, he'd definitely kill you now." "He'll think it was my wife," he chuckled. "And here I thought you let her off too easily," the other replied with a grin. The realization hit Martin like a knife. If Frank believed Angie was responsible, he'd stop at nothing for revenge. She was as good as dead. The thought sobered him, and his laughter faded. "I didn't think it through. I don't want her to get hurt," he said, his voice almost pleading as the potential consequences of his prank flashed through his mind. "No matter. We can't do anything to help her," stated the inspector. "Can't or won't?" Martin asked, fixing him with a cold stare. "Perhaps I won't testify." The stern look he received told Martin that, at least for now, he had no leverage. The reality that both he and his wife were essentially prisoners, supposedly for their own protection but confined all the same, sank in. Several hundred miles away, Angie was engrossed in thinking, writing, crossing out, rethinking and rewriting her confession. "My dearest husband, I'm sorry for what I've done with Frankie Grimm and for how I've hurt you. I can't begin to express how remorseful I am or how to ask for your forgiveness. As you've likely guessed, it all started because of Charlotte. About a year ago, while you were away, Charlotte told me she had a double date planned with Marie, Frank, and another man. She mentioned that Marie had to cancel and asked if I could fill in. I said no, but she insisted she was desperate and assured me that nothing would be expected. Nothing intimate. Foolishly, I believed her. The evening was supposed to be just dinner and dancing, and I was paired with Frank. I still don't fully understand how we went from the club to his bed. I've tried to make sense of it for weeks after that first time, and again since you've been away. All I know is that I can't explain it. I admit I found him attractive when we first met. There's something about powerful men. Even you must acknowledge his influence. He was simply too difficult to refuse. I felt immense guilt for betraying you. The next time you were away, Charlotte told me he wanted to see me again. I told her no. I did, honestly. Please believe me. He showed up at our house uninvited late at night. I didn't want to let him in. He said he just wanted to talk about what happened last time, so I invited him in for a drink and a conversation. Just talk. That was genuinely the only reason I let him through the door. I shouldn't have. Maybe we could have salvaged what we had. That night was the first time I let him have me at home, the first time our marital bed was defiled. After he left, I cried myself to sleep. The next time you were away, the same thing happened. The time after that, he took from me what remained of my innocence. I wish I could say I wanted it to be you, but by then I was ensnared. At the time, I was glad he was the first in that way. It was only when you forced yourself upon me that I began to realize it should have been you treating me as he did. That the only reason you hadn't treated me like that was because you loved me, respected me, and saw me as your equal. As I reflect on my mistakes, my lack of respect, and the way I took you for granted, I am overwhelmed with regret for the pain I caused. I'm sorry, my love. My actions were driven by selfishness and weakness, and I failed to see the damage I was doing. When I began prioritizing someone else's influence over the love and trust we shared, I knew deep down it was wrong. The guilt grew as I let it continue, and I betrayed the connection we had. To my shame, I even allowed myself to act out of malice, doing things I deeply regret. Looking back, I am horrified by my own behavior and how far I strayed from the person I should have been. I know now that forgiveness may not be possible, not from you and not from myself. My mistakes have left a mark that can never be undone. I don't deserve your kindness or understanding, but please know that I will carry this guilt with me always. Goodbye, my love. Angie. She folded the note and placed it gently on the table, placing her handbag over it. Taking a moment to steady herself, she walked to the bathroom, turning on the faucet and sitting quietly, lost in thought. For a week, Martin was confined to a small apartment, surviving on takeout meals. His days were spent answering questions about his knowledge of the Grimm's business, preparing for his court appearance, or being trained for his new identity as Eric Williams. His routine was monotonous, but he knew it was a necessary step toward starting over. A week later, he was moved to a more comfortable and secluded location. Once settled, Gray came to visit. From the moment Gray entered the cottage, Eric sensed something was wrong. His 2 guards quietly left the room, giving them privacy. Gray looked at him with sadness in his eyes. "Martin, Eric, I have some news, and it's difficult to share. We sent someone to bring your wife back, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. She's gone. She passed away under tragic circumstances." Eric collapsed onto the floor, overcome with shock and grief. Gray stood nearby, his expression somber. He struggled to find the right words. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said softly. "This isn't your fault." Eric raised his head, his face a mix of anger and sorrow. "Fault? I don't blame myself, I blame them. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. I loved her for so long, even after everything." Gray studied him silently before reaching into his jacket and handing Eric a flask. "You might need this," he said gently. "I've got more in the car." Eric took it, his hands trembling slightly. "You always seem to know what I need," he muttered. Then Gray added, "There's a note for you. I have a copy if you'd like to read it. I don't know if it will bring you peace or make things harder." Eric stared at the folded piece of paper in Gray's hand, hesitating before taking it. After a moment, he opened it and began reading. Gray quietly left the room, giving him space to process her final words. Before stepping out, Gray paused and glanced back, his face filled with concern. Eric felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and regret. She left, just like that. After everything, she's gone. And now... He trailed off, his voice barely audible. His thoughts swirled with memories, both good and bad, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Later, he and Gray sat together sharing a drink. Eric began talking about his life as Martin, recalling the early, happy days of his relationship with Angie. Slowly, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, and Gray even shared his real name, a gesture that seemed to ease some of Eric's tension. As the night wore on, Eric's mood fluctuated. At one point, Gray became concerned about his emotional state. Hoping to distract him, Gray brought up an unexpected topic. "You know that surprise you left for Francois and his crew?" Gray asked, a slight smile breaking through the somber atmosphere. Eric looked at him, a faint grin forming. "What about it?" "Well, let's just say it created quite the stir. Turns out some of them were not fans of your creative touch. They talked, though, told us everything." The story brought a moment of levity, and for the first time in days, Eric felt a flicker of relief. Despite everything, he realized that perhaps he wasn't as alone in this new chapter of his life as he had feared. "We should be able to imprison Mr. Grimmard for a long time based solely on their confessions. The Chiswick brothers were also a great help. You probably won't even have to testify. He let that sink in. That gave us grounds to obtain warrants to search their properties and his. It seems your bosses, the Chiswick brothers, had encoded records, and Mr. Francois Grimard held the key. Between them, we accessed all his records. A lot of people are going down. Your small act of revenge has paid off. You've been more helpful than we could have imagined. Eric smiled at the news. He hadn't been looking forward to being in court, allowing Frankie to know he was alive. Also, and I wasn't going to tell you this, but the two men are involved in human trafficking. Your wife was destined for a brothel in Tehran. I don't think we could have prevented that for long. Even though those criminals will be safely locked up, others would have come for her. Gray fell silent. Perhaps he should have kept that information to himself. I'm so angry. Angry about what he did, what she did, and the whole messed-up situation, he ranted. I'm furious she can't be punished for what she did, the things she did to me. I'm angry that she's dead, and angry she's not here with me, and I feel like I'm dead. What am I supposed to do now? A dead man has no friends, no family, no one. I am all alone, he wailed, tears flowing freely from his eyes. Gray watched him, feeling powerless, inadequate, and useless. He found his eyes misting with empathy. You will have support, he offered, realizing as he spoke how hollow it sounded. Well, isn't that just great? Eric retorted sarcastically. Inspector Gray said nothing. He knew he had said too much, no doubt because he had drunk too much. He looked at the bottles. One was empty. The other wasn't far behind. Eric stumbled to his feet, swaying wildly, and lunged at the policeman. It's your fault she's dead. You dragged me into this, he raged. Eric landed on the inspector before he could rise from his seat to defend himself. He managed to get a couple of blows in before the noise brought the two guards into the room. They separated the two men and restrained Eric. Gray spoke to the guards in French, and after seating Eric back in his chair, they returned to their post. Sorry, I shouldn't blame you, said Eric as he regained his composure. It's okay, I understand. These last few weeks can't have been easy, Gray replied sincerely. He couldn't imagine what this poor man was feeling. He knew the facts, but knowing the facts can't explain the mix of emotions he must be going through. How about we finish this and get some rest, he suggested. Eric said nothing. Searching the floor, he found his overturned glass and offered it to Gray. Gray poured him the better half and then emptied the bottle into his own. Raising it, he said, "To a new and better life." A new life, Eric echoed, raising his glass. Martin's funeral was a quiet event, attended by only a handful of mourners. Angie's was even more desolate. Not even her friend Charlotte chose to attend. Eric wanted to be there, but was advised against it. The Saturday after the funerals, Eric Williams moved to Gloucester. Just over a week later, he started working as a data entry clerk. Francois Grimard was sentenced to multiple consecutive terms, 15 years each for human trafficking, profiting from immoral earnings, exploitation, rayee, making threats to facilitate prostitution, and conspiracy to commit murder. He received 10 years for smuggling, another 10 for dealing in restricted goods, and 20 years for 12 counts of bribery or attempted bribery of a public official. An additional 2 years were added for threatening behavior, plus 6 months for breaking and entering. Altogether, he wouldn't see freedom again. Curtis received a total of 70 years. Charles was sentenced to 47 years. The two traffickers got 20 years each. Many of the Grimm's employees were prosecuted, with most receiving sentences ranging from 2 to 18 years. Charlotte was sentenced to 5 years for procurement and profiting from immoral earnings. Eric continued his job as a data entry clerk until he was certain he was no longer under surveillance by Interpol or the British police. He remained vigilant until he was sure there had been no monitoring for over a year. He then took a 2-week holiday driving across Europe, curiously stopping in Brussels for only a few hours. Several months later, he retired to the Algarve. If anyone ever asked about his wealth, he would say he had invested well.